Warhammer Age of Sigmar Skirmish. Skirmish Games in the Age of Sigmar, the book that allows you to take your games of Age of Sigmar to a slightly smaller scale. The book itself isn't a particularly huge number of pages. I'd say it's about the size of one of the old copies of White Dwarf during the dark days when it was a very small and insubstantial publication. But this book is priced rather inexpensively, so I don't think anyone's really going to mind the fact that it's not a vast tome. So there are some pages of fluff, first of all, which I'm not going to delve into particularly deeply. I'm sure there are people out there that are much more expert fluffers than I am, so I'll leave that to them. We are going to look somewhat in depth at the rules here. So starting on this lovely page here, depicting various forces doing battle. And over the page is the start of the rules, and the first thing that'll grab you is that there are not very many pages of rules, as is traditional with Age of Sigmar. I'm going to go through each section and give you some brief thoughts on each one. First of all, it lets you know that there are some specific scenarios or battle plans in this book for skirmish battles, but it does also let you know that there is a possibility of modifying existing scenarios to use in skirmish battles. Each side will have a warband, nothing particularly complicated about that. That really just says rules for this bit are coming later. So it seems like a little bit of a pointless inclusion there. So your models do not group up into units. They're all individuals. They do not have to stay within an inch of each other. But special abilities granted by musicians or standard bearers will still affect units within 6 inches from that war scroll. So you can run them round as a unit if you want. Your force must be derived from either order, chaos, death, or destruction. You can't mix. And you can only use allegiance abilities for those grand alliances. So your general must be a hero. Unlike in Age of Sigmar, where you can just choose any model and nominate that as your general, even a skeleton, for example. In Skirmish, you must choose an actual hero to be the leader of your warband. Also, there's no such thing as inspiring presence, because Battle Shock works in a very different way, which we'll get to in a second. You can use command abilities if they're relevant. Of course, certain command abilities wouldn't be as useful in skirmish games because they rely on there being large units. Or you can take command abilities that are part of a special table, which is on the other page, which we'll also get to in a minute. So, Battle Shock tests, this is quite a big change. So each model doesn't have to take a Battle Shock test because that wouldn't make any sense since it's based on the number of models lost. So instead, your entire warband takes one combined Battle Shock test based on the number of casualties, and you will use your leader's bravery stat. And then however much you fail that test by, that many models will just flee the battle. Of your choice though. So it's quite interesting that you either have the option to just bulk out your force with cheap expendable models that would then just be removed if Battle Shock called for it, but then you're also putting yourself at risk of Battle Shock in the first place by having cheap, expendable, easily killable models that could put your others at risk when they run out. Summoned units. Some people wondering how summoning would work in a skirmish environment, and the simple answer is, it doesn't. There's no such thing as summoning in Age of Sigmar Skirmish, which I think is a little bit lame. I think they could have written some specific rules where, for example, a necromancer could just summon 1 or 2 skeletons to the battlefield. I don't think it would have been that difficult to conjure up rules for that. But no, just to keep it simple, it's completely out. No summoning whatsoever. The rules of 1 are in, with some slight changes. You can only attempt to cast a spell once per turn, regardless of how many wizards you have. Each different wizard can't keep attempting to cast that spell if the first one fails, for example. A roll of 1 to hit, wound, or save always fails, so that's the same. And also the third rule of 1 is the same, where any extra attacks generated can't then go on to generate extra attacks as well on their own. And we're on to the command abilities section now, and I'm not going to give you a huge amount of detail on all of them, but I'll just show you a few examples. So for example, Inspirational Fighter, you can re-roll hit rolls of 1 for friendly models within 6 inches of your general until your next hero phase. So of course all of these command abilities here are specific to Skirmish because a lot of characters out there will have command abilities that don't really fit. For instance, they may grant an extra attack to a unit within 12 inches, which obviously would be next to useless in Skirmish game. So all of these command abilities are designed to replace those. Let's have a look at what we've got for number 6 here. You can attempt to unbind 1 spell in each of your opponent's hero phases until your next hero phase. If your general is a wizard, you can attempt to unbind an additional spell. Artifacts of Power. Now, so as an example, Blessed Amulet, add 1 to your general's wounds characteristic. Or perhaps number 3, the Cursed Tome, add 1 to any casting rolls you make for your general. However, if your casting roll is double 1, your general suffers a mortal wound after the spell is resolved. Interesting. It has its own mysterious terrain table because, again, some of the mysterious terrain in Standard Age of Sigmar aren't suited to skirmish gaming. So as a little example, emboldening, if your general is within 3 inches of this terrain feature when you're taking a battle shock test, you can choose to re-roll the result. So the mysterious terrain table, mainly each one has a similar theme to the regular Age of Sigmar rules, but it's just been rewritten a bit so it actually fits in to skirmish games. Next up we have campaign rules, and this specific campaign that they've given you here, it's not the only way you can play a campaign, you could definitely write your own, but with this particular one here they give you a series of battle plans that you play each in order, and you earn rewards after the battle. You'll gain additional renown as well after the game, so that you can add models to your force. And then throughout the campaign, if it becomes too horribly one-sided, then there are some underdog bonuses here. In case you find that your renown is considerably lower than the enemy, you get some re-rolls. There are certain spells that can only be attained through rolling the correct number on the rewards of battle chart, which makes it extra interesting to take a wizard. There's information on each of the campaign missions here. It tells you which scenario to play for each one, and then you get to the final game where the winner of that one will win the overall campaign. So really the previous 5 scenarios are really just building up your forces and trying to become as powerful as possible heading into game 6. There's information for skirmish matched play, the way they suggest that you play this game in a competitive environment. There's certain scenarios that they recommend using, a scoring system. Now we get to each of the individual scenarios. Now I'm not going to dive into each one in any great specifics, but you get the gist of it just from the map. And I'm hoping to do some skirmish battle reports at some point soon, because there are a couple of people who have been hesitant to take the plunge into Age of Sigmar, but are definitely willing to try the skirmish version. So hopefully I should be able to play through all of these at some point. As you can see, they all have very different setups. They seem to be played entirely on a 4x4 area, which is obviously what those lovely 4x4 GW battle mats are for. And then we just have some more lovely colour imagery until... Right, this is the part that's quite interesting to me. This is what people were speculating over, which units are actually going to be in the book, how many of them can you take the options from the War Scroll, and so on. So it suggests starting a campaign with a renown of 25, and it suggests between about 50 and 100, just for regular games. So we'll see that in a campaign it's going to be quite difficult to start off with any kind of decent sized force, but that's clearly what they want. So all your models must come from the same Grand Alliance, so any order, any destruction, chaos or death, so you can combine the various sub-factions. Your band must include a minimum of 3 models and 1 must be a hero. You can ignore the minimum size requirements on a War Scroll, so you can just take 1 of each kind of model from each War Scroll rather than having to have 5 or 10 of something. You can take any weapon combinations, so if your unit has multiple options for weapons you could arm them all in different ways. However, you must adhere to the limitations on special weapons. The example they give here is that only 1 in 5 Orc Brutes can be armed with a massive gore chopper. And you're also only allowed to use each War Scroll once. So what that means is you can't just take 1 War Scroll of, for instance, Caradron Overlord Arcanauts and say, okay, I've only got 1 model in this unit, he's going to have the Skyhook. And then I'm going to have a second unit of Arcanauts, and he's also going to have a Skyhook. So you couldn't do that because you're only allowed to include each War Scroll once. So it seems the trick to creating the ultimate weapon combos would be just to take a small number of models from each War Scroll and have each one with a special weapon, as many as you can possibly have. If I'm reading it correctly anyway, so your first Auric Brute would be able to have the massive Gore Chopper, because only 1 in 5 is allowed to have it, but then if you have another 4, then they wouldn't be allowed. I don't believe you need to actually take 5 in order to unlock the ability to take that weapon. At least that's the way people have been reporting it. I could see some people potentially misreading it though, so maybe they could do with clarifying that. You can only include each champion model once per War Scroll, and since you can only take each War Scroll once, then that means you'll just have 1 of those champions. You can't use any War Scroll battalions even if you fit the requirements. Makes sense. Now let's look specifically at some of the factions now. They have the point values for the units and all the options that they've written into the book. Now, before I go through this, some people have been coming up with their own formulas to include certain units that aren't in the book. which is divide the number of points by the number of models in the unit, and then divide that by 5, and you'll get roughly what you should be paying in Skirmish. However, I'm not sure that's necessarily the best way to go, because GW have clearly left out some of those units for a reason, and maybe some of them they believe would either be overpowered or underpowered or just wouldn't make sense in a Skirmish game. So I would have second thoughts about that. But I'm sure there are people vigorously testing the units that they've formulated their own point values for. So time will tell on that. But I would recommend to start with just sticking to what's in the book, at least, unless you just don't own any models in the book, in which case, go nuts. For example, Brayherds, if you wanted to take all Beastmen, you only have 5 options, which doesn't sound like a lot. And when you look at their point values, you'll see that you would end up with quite a significant number of models if you went purely Brayherd. The Great Bray Shaman being 18 points, but if you're going a 50-point game, you'd end up with quite a lot of guys here. Even if you have Bestigors, they're only 3 points each, or Renown each, should I say. I've heard people recommend keeping the warband size low in terms of model count, because the game can get quite complicated otherwise, and I would probably agree with that. You wouldn't want to bring nothing but a Great Bray Shaman and then 32 Ungors to a 50 Renown game. The various Skaven clans have very few options in each one. Few more for Clan Scryer. Now, the Doom Wheel is actually in there, interestingly enough. So there are a few big things in there. Demons, you have a few options for each, but of course, Tzeentch have more. And you get quite a few options for Slaanesh, actually. But then, of course, the factions with the most, among them you'd expect to be the Khorne Bloodbound, because they've had so many releases since Age of Sigmar hit, and of course you get a huge amount to choose from there. Lots of different characters. Slaves to Darkness, you get quite a few for your mortal Chaos Forces. More Tzeentchy goodness. With Death, you do not have that much to choose from, really. Obviously, because there's only one army in there. Flesh Eater Courts seemingly having the most options here if you wanted to stick to just one of them. We get to Destruction, and Beastclaw Raiders only have one entry, the Mournfang Pack, because of course they're leaving out a lot of the large monsters. And there's the rest of the Destruction. So again, not a huge amount. Now, we'll see that there is a vast number of options in the Order section, though. Here's the first page, where we have the likes of the Free People, the Dark Elves. On the next page, you have the likes of the Dispossessed, Fire Slayers, Caradron Overlords down here, who have quite a few options themselves. And the one thing that jumps out at me, the Arcanaut Admiral being 28 points sounds quite expensive for a hero in this game. I'm going to assume what's happened with some of the pointing of these guys is that some of the abilities on their war scrolls match up a lot better in skirmish play than others. So, for example, a character like the Endrin Master here, he has abilities that involve repairing ships, which of course aren't going to be part of the game. So you would assume that leads to a slightly lower renown cost for him, whereas the Admiral has abilities that are going to be quite suitable for skirmish, so he is quite expensive. And here you also have the Seraphon. And on the final page of Renown Costs here, you have Wanderers, Sylvaneth, and the biggest one of all, Stormcast Eternals. Look at those. Just a huge number of options. Let's see who the most expensive one is. It looks like the Knight Vexilor at 28 points. There's a lot of them that rock in at 24 points. Oh, the Concussors are 28 points each as well, or Renown. I'm sure everyone's just going to call it points though. So Concussors, of course, they're not even really heroes. Rocking in at 28 renown each, that's quite a substantial price to be paying, but then they are ridiculously good. Almost too good, perhaps, for skirmish games, but then they are heavily pointed. Let's see what jumps out at me as good value for the Stormcast Eternals here. Liberators at only 4 points, you can't really argue with that. But I would say what jumps out at me immediately as potentially a bit of a bargain would be Judicators for only 6 points. On a 4x4 table, there's not going to be a lot of space to hide from their shooting attacks. So I can definitely see myself including a couple of those. It's something that the formulas people coming up with don't necessarily factor in. They might have also, GW, weighed up the speed of certain units as well on a slightly smaller playing surface. So there are definitely other factors that could be brought into the equation when working out points for units for this game. They also give you a nice page at the back here which you have permission to photocopy for personal use only. Isn't that nice of them? Where you can keep your entire roster in there. Reminds me of the good old days where they would put the sheets in the back of the book. Days which are not really with us anymore in the time of war scrolls. There's not that much need for roster sheets anymore. And that's it, we've reached the back cover. If anything jumps out at anyone from their own travels into the vast, it's not that vast, the wilderness of Age of Sigmar Skirmish, the rules, then let me know what you think. If you think you've managed to break the game with any combos already, let me know. If there's anything that disappoints you about this rule set, anything that exceeded your expectations, and you can expect to see quite a few battle reports from me on Age of Sigmar Skirmish, hopefully. Not only is it likely I'll be able to play some in-person games of Age of Sigmar Skirmish, it's also entirely possible that this game would work very nicely over a Google Hangout. So that's something that may happen, which would allow me to play against people from slightly further afield. Because of the smaller playing area and lower number of models, it would be far easier than running entire full games of Age of Sigmar. So keep your eyes peeled for that as well. And now, if you'll excuse me, I've got Caradron Overlords to paint. Ta-ta for now.